Cole Merritt had been standing in his father's kitchen for 11 minutes, holding a box that weighed 5 pounds and contained everything that was left of the man. The dog had gone outside. The back door was open a few inches, and Juniper had pushed through without a sound. Cole had been staring at the label. Raymond Merritt, date of death, a case number. He had been reading those words and had not understood any of them yet. Then he heard the digging, not the ordinary sound of a tree moving through dead grass. Something harder. A dog that has decided on a spot and is not going to stop. Juniper was at the far edge of the garden near the old stone wall, both front paws in the earth, working fast. She did not look up when he appeared. In 4 years, that dog had never dug a hole in her life. What she pulled from the ground 3 minutes later stopped him where he stood. Thank you for being here. Please subscribe and like this video. And before we continue, tell me, where are you watching from? Drop your city or country in the comments. I love knowing who's out there listening. Cole had driven down from Nashville on a Wednesday, which was the earliest the funeral home in Mill Haven would have the remains ready. He had taken 2 days off work, though he had only told his supervisor one because he wasn't sure how long it would take to go through a house, and he didn't want to have to explain himself twice. He was a man in his early to mid-50s, built tall and lean with the quiet economic movements of someone who has spent a lifetime working. His brown hair, grown a little too long, was streaked with silver at the temples. His face was weathered and rugged, carved by the sun and by memories that were just as harsh. Yet his eyes held a deep, settled kindness that had survived everything. He pulled on his boots, the leather cracked and dark with use. He shrugged into his old brown leather jacket and left it unzipped, revealing the dark flannel shirt beneath. Juniper was already in the back seat of the truck when he came out of the motel at 6 in the morning. She had been watching the door from the moment he went inside the night before. She did that. She tracked exits, not entrances. She always wanted to know where you were going, not where you came from. Cole and his father had not spoken in 3 years. That was not a record between them. There had been a stretch in the 90s when they went 4 years without a phone call, both of them waiting on the other one, neither one willing to go first. They had always been like that. 2 men standing on opposite sides of a door, neither one reaching for the handle. Raymond Merritt had been 71 years old. He had lived in the same house in Mill Haven for 43 years, the same house where Cole had grown up, the same house with the stone wall in the back garden where his father had grown tomatoes every summer until he was too old to manage the bending. He had died alone, which Cole knew before anyone told him, because that was the kind of man his father was. The neighbor, a woman named Doris Hallowell, was the one who called. She had Cole's number from 7 years ago, written on a notepad she kept beside the phone, and she had the tone of a woman who had prepared herself for this conversation well in advance. She did not offer condolences the way most people do. She just said, "He's gone, and I thought you'd want to know." And she waited. Cole had said thank you. He had meant it. Juniper rode the whole 4 hours without making a sound, which was not unusual. She was a gray and white German Shepherd, 4 years old, 78 pounds, with amber eyes that caught light in a way that made her look like she was thinking about something specific. Cole had raised her from a pup. She had been with him through the Nashville apartment, through the truck, through a motel outside Knoxville while he figured out what came next. She was not a working dog in the official sense. She had never been trained for anything formal, but she had an instinct for stillness that Cole respected. She knew when to be quiet, and she knew when something mattered. And she had never once in 4 years been wrong about the difference. The drive to Mill Haven took them through hills that had gone the color of rust and copper, the November light sitting flat and cold on everything. Cole did not listen to the radio. He had the window down 2 inches, and the cold came through steady, and the truck smelled like diesel and the dry smell of old fabric. Juniper had her nose pointed at the window gap. She did not sleep. He had not told anyone he was coming. There was no one to tell. The house looked smaller than he remembered, which was something people said about childhood homes, but which he had never believed until he was standing in the driveway looking at it. It was a single-story, white clapboard with a detached garage and a back garden that ran to an old stone wall, and it had the particular stillness of a place where nothing had been moved in a long time. Doris Halliwell had left a key under the mat on the front porch, along with a note that said the power and water were still on, and that she had left a casserole in the refrigerator, and that she was sorry for his loss. The note had been written carefully, in the handwriting of someone who had learned to write with a proper pen and never forgotten how. Cole folded it and put it in his jacket pocket. The inside of the house was clean and organized in a way that felt deliberate. His father had always kept the kitchen a certain way, cans lined up in alphabetical order and on the counter, mail stacked by date, the table clear except for whatever was currently in use. Cole walked through the rooms slowly, Juniper moving ahead of him through each doorway, checking the room and then stepping aside. His father's bedroom was the hardest room, not because of anything he found there, but because of what was missing from it. No photographs on the walls, no decorations of any kind. A bed that had been made so tightly it looked like it had never been slept in, though Cole knew that was just how his father made a bed. A pair of reading glasses on the nightstand beside a library book that had been returned to page 1, bookmark removed. He stood in the doorway for a moment, Juniper sitting beside his left knee, and then he moved on. On the second morning, Cole was making coffee when Juniper went to the back door and sat. She had done this before, once, the previous afternoon. He had let her out, and she had moved around the garden in a slow, methodical circle, not running, not sniffing, the way dogs sniff when they're tracking something recent, but walking steadily, the way she walked when she was working through something in her head. He had stood at the door and watched her for 10 minutes. She had done a full circuit of the garden and then sat at the far end near the stone wall and looked back at the house. He had called her in and she had come, but she looked at the door twice on the way back through the kitchen. Now she was at the door again, sitting straight, amber eyes forward, ears up, not asking, waiting. Cole opened the door and let her out. He watched her from the window. She went directly to the far corner of the garden near the stone wall, to the same place she had sat the day before. She stood there for almost a full minute, motionless. Then she lowered her head and began to move in a tight circle. He topped off his coffee and watched. She was not digging. Not yet. She was nosing the ground in small, careful passes, the way she moved when she had found something she wasn't sure of yet. Her tail was down. Not afraid. Focused. There was a difference, and Cole had spent 4 years learning it. He did not call her in. He had learned that too. That evening, Cole found the notebooks. They were in the workshop, not the house. 3 of them, identical black composition notebooks, lined up on the middle shelf of a metal rack above the workbench. His father had labeled the spines in his small, even handwriting. 1994 to 1998, 1999 to 2006, 2007 to 2018. Cole picked up the first one and thought at first it was a record of the house, the repairs, washes, maintenance schedules. His father had been that kind of man. He kept records of everything. The furnace filter, the driveway, every car inspection. Cole opened to a random page. March 14th, 1995. C transferred to Fort Hood, Texas. Third reassignment in 14 months. Cole stopped. He turned back to the beginning and began to read from the first entry. His father had been tracking him. Not surveillance, not obsession, but for 24 years, Raymond Merritt had been writing down what he knew about his son's life in the Army, in the same careful notebooks he used for the furnace and the driveway. Dates and locations when he could get them. Gaps where he couldn't. A name here and there. Someone who knew someone who had heard something. In 1997, heard through Bill Haskins that C was in Bosnia. Nothing more. In 2001, Red Cross notification. C injured, non-critical, did not call. That last sentence was underlined, not for emphasis, for record. He did it. He wrote it down so he would not be able to pretend otherwise. Cole turned pages. The entries got shorter as the years went on. A line here, a date there, but they did not stop. In 2011, when Cole had come back from his last deployment and moved to Nashville and stopped returning calls for a while, there was an entry. C is back. Danny Kowalski saw him at a gas station outside the city. Didn't approach. In 2014, C has a dog now, apparently. A shepherd. That entry had nothing after it, just the information sitting there on the page. Cole looked at Juniper. She lifted her head slightly, watched him, put it back down. He did not know who had told his father about the dog. He had not spoken to his father in 3 years at the time of that entry. He had not spoken to Danny Kowalski in longer. The network of information was invisible to him, had always been invisible to him, and he understood now that he had been living inside it his whole life without knowing it existed. He turned to the last page with writing in the third notebook. The final entry was dated 8 months ago in February. C's birthday. Did not call. He would not have wanted me to. Or maybe he would have. I don't know anymore. Cole closed the notebook. December 10th, 2003. C's number is the same. I know because I dial it sometimes and hang up before it connects. I don't know what I would say. He sat on the metal stool in the workshop with the fluorescent tube humming above him and Juniper at his feet on the concrete floor, her head on her paws, amber eyes tracking him as he sat. He had known his whole adult life that his father was not a man of words. He had spent 30 years being angry about that. He had 30 years of evidence that his father simply accepted the silence and filled it with his own life. The garden, the workshop, the canned goods in alphabetical order. He had not understood that his father had been filling it with something else entirely. He sat there for a long time after that. He thought about his last deployment, 2009, coming back to a Nashville he did not quite recognize as his own. He had gone quiet himself that year, not returning calls, not explaining, just going quiet the way his father went quiet. And he had never once connected the two things until now. He was his father's son in the way he had most resented his father. He sat with that for a while. He was still sitting there when the fluorescent tube finally hummed out and the workshop went dark. And he sat in the dark for a while after that, the notebooks on his lap, not moving. That was when his phone rang. It was 9:15 in the evening, and the number on the screen was a Nashville area code he didn't recognize. He let it ring twice, then answered. The man on the other end introduced himself as Gary Potts, real estate attorney, calling on behalf of Weston County Realty, retained by Raymond Merritt 6 months before his death to handle the sale of the property at 14 Harlan Road, Millhaven, Tennessee. The buyers had been under contract for 3 months. Closing was scheduled for 9 a.m. Thursday. That was tomorrow. Cole asked him to repeat that. The attorney repeated it. Cole sat very still in the dark workshop with the notebook on his knee and the phone against his ear, and Juniper watching him from the floor. His father had put the house under contract 6 months before he died. The buyers had already done their inspection. The movers were scheduled for the weekend. The attorney had left 3 voicemails at a Nashville number Cole recognized as his own. He had not listened to his voicemail in 8 days. If Cole did not sign the executor documents by 8 a.m. Thursday, the sale would be delayed 30 days minimum. Penalties would accrue against the estate, and the buyers, who had already given notice on their apartment in Knoxville, would potentially sue. Cole said he would need until morning. The attorney said 8 o'clock. That was 10 hours from now. He put the phone in his jacket pocket and did not move for a moment. He thought about his father putting the house under contract without telling him. He thought about all the things his father had done without telling him, and all the things he had found out about after the fact. And he thought that this was consistent with everything he now understood about how Raymond Merritt operated. He kept his own counsel. He made his own arrangements. He left things for other people to find. Cole set the notebooks back on the shelf in order. He straightened them the way his father would have straightened them. Then he picked up his jacket from the stool and put it on. He thought about the back garden. He thought about Juniper, standing at the same spot near the stone wall every morning for 3 days, circling the same patch of ground, sitting and watching the house. He had told himself it was nothing. He had told himself that for 3 days because he was not ready for it to be something. And now he had 10 hours, and then the house would belong to someone else, and the garden would belong to someone else, and whatever was under that ground near the stone wall would belong to someone else, would stay there, would not be found. He walked to the back door. His father's shovel was leaning against the house wall where it always was, handle up, blade clean. Cole took it. Juniper was at his heel before he reached the porch steps. The November night was cold and clear, Frost already forming on the dead grass, the single bulb above the back door throwing a circle of yellow 10 feet into the garden and nothing beyond. He walked to the stone wall with the flashlight in his left hand and the shovel in his right, and Juniper walked beside him, her shoulder brushing his leg with each step. At the spot near the wall where she had been circling for 3 days, he stopped. She sat. He pushed the blade into the ground. The ground was hard from the frost, but not frozen solid. He broke the surface in 3 pushes, the blade going in at an angle the way his father had taught him to work hard ground, and the soil came up in chunks of pale clay and dead root. Juniper stepped back to give him room but did not leave. She sat 2 feet behind him and watched the hole. The shovel hit something on the 4th push. Not rock. Metal. A flat sound, hollow underneath. Cole got down on one knee and pushed the loose earth aside with his hand. The soil was cold and damp and smelled of clay and something older underneath. The smell of ground that had not been turned in a long time. He found the edge of it. A lid, metal, a small rectangle about the size of a shoebox painted dark green. The kind of surplus box that was sold at hardware stores in the 80s for keeping tools from rusting. He had seen one exactly like it in his father's workshop, on the top shelf pushed to the back. He worked it free of the earth slowly, the cold numbing his fingers, and lifted it out. It was not heavy. He shook it once and heard a flat, soft sound. Paper, not tools. Something wrapped or folded, not loose. Juniper came forward and sniffed the side of the box once, then stepped back and sat. Cole sat back on his heels and looked at the box for a moment. The green paint had held well beneath the soil. There was rust at the seam and a dark stain on one corner where moisture had gotten in over the years, but it was intact. Someone had sealed the lid with electrical tape, black tape, the cheap kind, dried to a flake at the edges but still holding. His father's handwriting was on the tape, written in the permanent marker his father kept on the workshop bench. 2 words, Cole's name. He peeled the tape back carefully. The lid came up with a small resistance and then gave. Inside, wrapped in a single piece of wax paper, was an envelope. White, letter-sized, sealed. And beneath it, face down, a photograph. He took out the photograph first. It was him, 19 years old, in uniform, standing in front of a building he recognized as the processing center at Fort Benning, Georgia. He was squinting into the light. He had his hands at his sides and his chin at the angle you learned in the first week. He did not remember this photograph being taken. He did not know who had taken it. On the back, in his father's handwriting, August 1991. Cole, first week. He turned the photograph over and looked at his own face. 19 years old. He had been thinner then, and harder in a different way, the way young men are hard before life has taught them what hardness costs. He thought about where that photograph had come from. He had not sent it home. He had not been in the habit of sending things home. The phone calls had been brief and functional, the visits home between deployments shorter than they should have been, the silences in those visits longer than either of them knew how to fill. Apparently someone had been at Fort Benning in August of 1991, or known someone who was or managed to obtain the photograph through some channel Cole would never trace. Apparently his father had kept it for 32 years. He put the photograph down on his knee and picked up the envelope. His name was on the front. No address, no return address. The handwriting was his father's, but it looked different from the notebook entries. Less controlled, like something written quickly or under pressure. He opened it. The letter was 2 pages, handwritten on lined paper from a legal pad. The date at the top was November 14th, 1998. Cole knew that date. He had never told his father about it. He had never told anyone outside of the Army about it. On November 14th, 1998, a vehicle he was traveling in outside Pristina, Kosovo, had been hit by an anti-tank mine. 3 men had been injured. Cole had walked away with a concussion and a fractured wrist and a sound in his left ear that lasted 2 weeks. He had written in his incident report that he had been uninjured because the wrist healed clean and the concussion was not documented, and he did not want the paperwork. He had never spoken about it to his family. He read the first paragraph. Cole, I heard from Bill Haskins that there was an incident. He couldn't tell me much. He said you were involved and that you were okay, but he couldn't say more than that. I have been sitting at this table for 3 days trying to write this letter. I have started it 11 times. I keep getting to the third sentence and stopping because I don't know what the right thing is to say, and by the time I figure it out, I am afraid it will be too late. Cole did not move. The November night was around him, the circle of yellow light from the house barely reaching the wall, the flashlight on the ground beside the open box, Juniper pressed against his left leg with her head on her paws. He thought about what it must have been like to sit at that table for 3 days. His father had been 60 years old in 1998. He had been living alone in this house since Cole's mother passed in 1993, cooking his own meals, keeping his own schedule, lining up the canned goods in alphabetical order because that was how he organized things when there was no one around to tell him it wasn't necessary. He had been sitting at that kitchen table with a legal pad and a pen, starting the letter 11 times, getting to the third sentence and stopping. Cole had been in a field hospital outside Pristina with a headache that lasted 4 days and a wrist in a removable splint that he took off before the next mission brief because he did not want anyone to ask questions. He had not called home. He had not told anyone. He had eaten what they gave him and gotten back in the vehicle and moved on. And that had been November of 1998, and he had not thought about it much since. His father had been thinking about it ever since. He read on. I know you think I don't pay attention. I know you think I don't ask because I don't care. That is not the truth. The truth is that I have been following you since the day you left for Fort Benning, and I have not known how to tell you that without it sounding like something it isn't. I have a list going back to 1991. Every base, every transfer I could find out about. I called the Army twice and they wouldn't tell me anything, and I had to work around the edges of it, through Bill, through Danny Kowalski, through a man named Reese, who I met at the hardware store in 2001, who turned out to know someone at your unit in Kandahar. I am not proud of all of it, but I needed to know you were alive. Cole turned to the second page. His hands were steady. He had spent a long time learning to keep his hands steady. He thought about Danny Kowalski. Danny Kowalski had been a year ahead of Cole in school, had gone into the reserves, had ended up in logistics somewhere in the Tennessee National Guard. Cole had not thought about Danny Kowalski in 15 years. He had not known his father, and Danny Kowalski had ever spoken. He had assumed, without ever examining the assumption, that his father had simply accepted the silence between them and filled it with his own life. He had not understood that his father had been filling it with something else entirely. I was not a good father at saying things directly. I knew it when you were young, and I did not know how to change it, and the longer I didn't change it, the harder it got. By the time you were in high school, I had been quiet for so long that I thought if I started talking, it would sound wrong. I thought you would hear it wrong. I thought you would hear it as something coming too late from someone who should have spoken earlier. That may be true. I don't know. He stopped reading. He set the letter on the flat surface of the box and looked up at the house. The kitchen light was on. The back door was open, the same 2 inches. It had always been open. He had 10 hours and 6 had already passed, and he was sitting in the November frost with a letter from 1998 in his hands. He thought about being 16. He thought about asking his father if he had done a good job on something in the yard, and his father saying yes, in a tone that meant the matter was closed, and walking away. Not unkindly, just finished. Cole had stood there for a moment and then gone inside and told himself that this was simply how his father was and that it was not about him. He had told himself that for 37 years. He picked the letter back up. What I know is that on November 14th, when Bill called me and said there had been an incident and that he thought you were all right, I sat down at this table and I could not stand up for 2 hours. Your mother used to say that I saved my feelings for other people's emergencies. She was right. I could speak at a stranger's funeral, but I could not tell you that I was proud of you. I don't know why that is. I think I was afraid you would not believe me. I think I was afraid it would sound like the first time I was saying it, and I did not want you to think it was the first time. He read that sentence again. I was afraid it would sound like the first time I was saying it, and I did not want you to think it was the first time. He understood that sentence in a way that probably only one kind of person could understand it. He had been that kind of person himself, with different people and at different times. Saying nothing because the words he had available all felt like they were arriving too late. All felt insufficient for the weight of unsaid things behind them. He had held conversations in his head for years. Conversations where everything came out right and clearly, and the other person understood completely. And he had never found his way to having them out loud. His father had written 12 drafts. His father had buried the 12th one in the garden. If you have ever had something to say to someone and never found the right moment, you already know what it costs to wait. Cole had done it himself. He had a brother-in-law he had not spoken to in 6 years over a disagreement he could no longer fully reconstruct. He had a friend from Fort Benning, a man named Curtis Webb, who had called him twice after Cole got back from Kandahar, and Cole had not called back. And now Curtis Webb was a name he hadn't thought about in a long time, and probably never would think about enough to do anything. He had a father who had dialed his number and hung up before it connected. The whole family, apparently, was built from the same material. Two men who could not say the thing directly, standing on opposite sides of a door, neither one reaching for the handle. He had been angry at his father for that for 30 years. He was not angry anymore. He did not have a word yet for what he was. He would figure that out on the drive back to Nashville. So I am writing it. Cole, I have been proud of you since the first week you were alive. I have been proud of you at every transfer and every reassignment and every time you came back. I have your photograph from Fort Benning. I have been looking at it for 7 years. I should have sent this letter in 1998. I am going to bury it in the garden instead because I am a coward and I want you to find it when I am gone. I hope you find it. I hope it is enough. Your father. Cole sat back against the stone wall with the letter in his hands and the box beside him and Juniper's weight warm against his leg. He read it twice. The second time was slower. He read each sentence the way you read something when you are trying to understand not just the words, but the person behind them. His father had been 60 years old, sitting alone at the kitchen table 3 days after his son nearly died, writing a letter he could not send. 11 drafts that did not work. The 12th, 2 pages, then the wax paper, then the electrical tape, then the garden. He did not know, sitting there in the November night with the frost on the dead grass and the house light in the distance, whether it was enough. He thought about the word enough. He thought about what his father meant by it and what he would have meant by it himself. And he thought they probably meant the same thing, which was not a question about sufficiency, but about whether the truth could travel the distance between two men who had spent 30 years not saying it. The photograph was on his knee, 19 years old, squinting at the sun, hands at his sides. His father had kept it for 32 years. He set the letter down on the ground beside him and picked up the photograph with both hands and looked at the face of the 19-year-old standing in the August Georgia light. He thought, you were looking at this while I was in Kandahar. You were looking at this when I didn't return calls. You were looking at this at 3 in the morning when the house was empty and you had no one to ask how I was doing. He set the photograph carefully, face up, on the flat surface of the metal box. He thought about who had taken it, August 1991, Fort Benning, Georgia. He had been there for 5 days at that point. He had known approximately 4 people. He had not been in the habit of having his photograph taken. He had not been in the habit of much of anything yet. He was 19 years old and he was at the beginning of something, and he had no idea what the end of it would look like. His father had been 42 years old that August, living in the house in Millhaven, tending the garden, keeping the notebooks, getting the photograph through some channel Cole would never trace, keeping it for 32 years. Juniper shifted against his leg, resettling herself, then went still again. December 10, 2003. C's number is the same. I know because I dial it sometimes and hang up before it connects. I don't know what I would say. Cole had never known. For all those years in the Nashville apartment with his phone on the table, he had not known that somewhere in Millhaven, Tennessee, a man was dialing his number and stopping before it connected, and writing down that he had done it so there would be a record. He thought about the attorney's call. 9 a.m., the house sold, the garden transferred to someone else. He had found this box in the last hours before it would have been buried under someone else's property forever. He thought about his father staying in this house for 43 years. If the house was an anchor to the box, if the box was an anchor to Cole, he did not know, he would never know. That was the shape of it. He looked at the photograph again. August 1991, Cole, first week. He had been 19 years old and had not known a single thing about what was coming. He had stood there squinting into the Fort Benning morning and had not known that his father was standing in the kitchen of this house writing down the date and keeping it. He knew now. Juniper pressed her head against his forearm, briefly, and then raised it again. He went back inside and signed the executor documents at the kitchen table at 10 minutes past midnight and sent them to the attorney's email. He sat at the table after that with the box and the letter and the photograph arranged in front of him and the cardboard box from the funeral home at the far end of the table. His father's kitchen, the cans in alphabetical order on the counter, the dish towel with the blue stripe on the oven handle, the library book on the nightstand with the bookmark removed, the notebooks in the workshop with their careful entries. All of it was going to belong to someone else in 9 hours. All of it except the letter and the photograph and the metal box and whatever he chose to take with him when he drove back to Nashville. He washed the dirt from his hands at the kitchen sink. Through the window above the sink, he could see the garden, the stone wall at the far end, the small dark rectangle of turned earth where the hole had been. He dried his hands on his father's dish towel. He went to the table and stood in front of the cardboard box with the label that said Raymond Merritt and the date of death and the case number and the funeral home's return address. He had been standing in front of this box or around this box or near this box since he drove into Millhaven 48 hours ago, and he had not opened it yet. He picked it up and carried it to the back door and went outside and walked to the garden. Juniper followed him. He stood at the edge of the garden and looked at the house for a moment. The white clapboard, the kitchen window, the back door with the gap at the bottom that his father had never fixed, the workshop window dark. He set the cardboard box down on the stone wall next to the metal box with Cole's name on the tape. He did not say anything. He was not a man who spoke to the dead, but he thought about what his father had written. I think you would hear it as something coming too late. He thought maybe his father had been wrong about that. He thought maybe it is not about when something comes. He thought maybe it is only about whether it comes at all. He looked at the 2 boxes on the wall. The letter had taken 12 drafts and 25 years to reach him. It had needed a Joanna night deadline and a frost-hardened garden and 4 years of a woman named Doris Hallowell keeping a phone number on a notepad beside her kitchen phone. That was a lot of moving parts for one letter. His father would have found that efficient. His father would have found that exactly sufficient. Juniper was beside him, her shoulder against his leg. She was looking out at the back of the property, the way she had looked out at it every morning for 3 days. He still did not know what she was watching for. He still did not know why she had circled that spot, why she had known, why she had waited for him to follow. He thought about all the things in his life that he could not explain and had stopped trying to. He set the metal box down on the wall and put his hand on the cardboard one and just stood there for a moment with his hand on it, the way you stand when you are not ready to walk away, but know that you will. The November night was around him, cold and clear, the creek behind the wall running steady and low, a bird moving somewhere in the dark trees beyond the property line. He was 53 years old and his father was 71 years gone, and he had found the letter with 11 minutes to spare. He thought that was exactly the kind of thing his father would have arranged, if his father had been the kind of man who arranged things, which apparently he had been all along. Cole took the letter and the photograph and put them inside his jacket, close to his chest where they would stay dry. He left both boxes on the stone wall. He walked back to the house with Juniper at his heel, and he did not look back. Some things you carry forward. Some things you leave where you found them. He never found out how she knew. Not from the letter, not from the notebooks, not from Doris Hallowell, who he spoke with briefly the next morning before he drove back to Nashville. Doris had said that Juniper had started sitting at the back fence on the first afternoon, before Cole had even arrived. She had seen her from the window. She had not thought anything of it. Dogs sit at fences. But she remembered it because the boo had been so still, and because she had been sitting at the exact corner near the stone wall, and because Doris had thought to herself at the time, that dog is waiting for something. Cole thanked her and put his truck in reverse and drove out of Mill Haven, Tennessee, with the letter and the photograph in his jacket and the cardboard box on the passenger seat, and Juniper in the back watching the town get smaller through the rear window. He did not know what she had been waiting for. He thought maybe she had not been waiting for something. Maybe she had already found it 3 days before he got there, and she had been waiting for him to be ready.